Hello, this video is about the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. The learning objective is to understand vocabulary terms related to the 1960 Civil Rights Movement so that we may appreciate the lessons that historical event can teach us about our lives and how the event still affects society today. The Common Core that we are addressing is number 4, which is to determine the meaning of words or phrases as they are used in a text or in a context. In this case, the California standard is 11.10. Students analyze the development of federal civil rights and voting rights. And we are addressing depth of knowledge 1, which is defined and use terms. The instruction would be you could click on the link here, which will give you this. I'll put the link later for this video. Si presionan aquí, va a ver la tarea en español. Aquí le explico cómo hacer um, the subtitles en español. Okay. All right. So step 2 is you're going to click on the link and it's going to give you the Quizlet, and you would sign in. And after you see the video and review the vocabulary words, you could also read them if you scroll down. But once you're done with the video, you could take the test. So I could check for understanding. And um, you will go to options and you will pick one of these. So I would pick, let me pick multiple choice. You could pick whichever one you like. Just don't pick written because it um, it marks it wrong. Okay, so you click on create test, and if you scroll down after you take the test and go to check answers. Okay, great. And I want you to take the test as many times so you could get a high grade on it. Try to get 100 on it. So you would then screenshot one, make sure your screenshot has your name, has that you did 33 questions, and your score. And then you would screenshot your results where it has the number 3 right here. Okay. And then remember to press submit on Schoology so I know when to grade it. Okay, so those are the instructions. So now let's start the lesson. So basically, before any lesson, ask yourself, well, what do you already know about the civil rights movement? Okay, and what images come to your mind? Okay, so now let's talk about the first term. Well, let's define the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is a social movement in the United States during the 1950s and 60s in which people organized to demand equal rights for African Americans and other minorities. People worked together to change unfair laws. They gave speeches, marches in the street, and participated in boycotts. So here we see people involved in these marches, and you see end segregation in public school, jobs for everyone now. Okay? So that is the civil rights movement when people protested to have equal rights. So here's an example of inequality where you have racial segregation. And racial segregation is the separation of humans into ethnic or racial groups in daily life. Generally applies to activities such as eating in restaurants, drinking from water fountains, using public toilets, attending school, going to the movies, riding on a bus, or in the rentals of purchased homes. So you see here how unfair the laws were. So usually, what was reserved for whites was fancier. The schools had better books, and what was given to minorities was always second class. Okay, and you see signs in restaurants like this sign here that says um, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. And if you were Latino, you were labeled as Mexican, no matter what country you came from. And then you have restroom signs, and you have restrooms for whites and restrooms for colored. You had separate seating areas, which was usually in the back of the restaurant or the back of the bus. So you had all these unfair laws, and this is why people protested in the 1960s. I just want to make clear because through my years teaching, many students say that Dr. King and the civil rights movement was about slavery. It was not about slavery. Slavery had ended already. So if you see here, from 1619 all the way to 1865, after the U.S. Civil War, you have slavery. But slavery ends here. What they were protesting was segregation, racial segregation, not slavery. So anything after 1860 will be segregation from 1860 to 1950. So I just to round it up, I put from in 100 years, 1860 to 1960, just to help people remember. We'll discuss this later. What's going on here? Okay. So yes, so the civil rights movement was about segregation, not slavery. All right. So here we have other examples of unfair laws. For instance, African Americans were disenfranchised. So disenfranchised means to deprive someone of the right to vote. We still have that going on today. For example, after the U.S. Civil War, African American males were given the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. However, Jim Crow laws, grandfather clause, poll taxes, and literacy exams prevented them from voting. Okay, so even though legally it says they have this right, the right was taken away from them. So, for instance, if they would go vote, they would be harassed. Many of them risked their lives just to have the ability to vote. And once they got there, they had to pay a fee, and usually they would charge minorities and not the white population. um, you have Jim Crow laws. So who is Jim Crow? Basically, after the civil rights movement, many African Americans were celebrating that they um, earned the right to vote. And you have this musician who made fun of African Americans, and he painted his face black and mocked African Americans, and there were many white Americans who laughed uh, at his music, who laughed with his music, and they mocked the celebration of ending slavery. So this is why it's very offensive. This is a white man pretending to be a black man, to for white people to color their faces black. Okay, so and it refers to laws passed after the Civil War to overstep the basic human rights and civil liberties of African Americans and other minorities. So it makes fun of, it mocks, it belittles, it humiliates people of color. Uh, those are the Jim Crow laws. And this was interesting. Another way to limit African Americans from voting, I put the link here. It's when minorities would go to vote, they had to take a literacy test. And this is an example of the literacy test. And keep in mind, in the 1860s, um, most people didn't go to school. So there were many white Americans who couldn't fill this out. Okay. And the questions are just uh, unless you memorize the Constitution, basically, it's the questions are quite difficult to answer, especially if someone is does is illiterate. So imagine this is in 1965. We're not even talking about the 1800s. We're talking about 1965. So this is not that long ago. This is like 55 years ago. Okay. Um, So we have many laws that are very racist. And speaking of that, you also have the grandfather clause. I did not explain that. It's basically a law that said if your grandfather was a slave, then you cannot vote. So obviously, it was a law directed towards African American males. Right, so this is why they were protesting because of all these Jim Crow laws, segregation, uh, when disenfranchised, all these discriminatory racist laws. All right, so now we'd like to discuss Supreme Court cases related to the civil rights movement. So, what are Supreme Court cases? The Supreme Court is the highest court of the United States. It sits at the top of the federal court system. It is part of the three branches in the systems of checks and balance. They have the power to declare laws unconstitutional. So, even though uh, we're used to, okay, the king has all the power. That's not true in this country. We don't have a king. We have a president, and he is always regulated by the Congress and the Supreme Court. So I know we discussed checks and balance, but basically the power of the Supreme Court is to declare any action that the president and the Congress does unconstitutional. So they have a great amount of power. So these are Supreme Court cases that are related to um, the evolution of civil rights. So the first one I would like to discuss is the Dred Scott case, and it was in 1857. So basically, Dred Scott sued for his freedom. Let me just explain a little bit using this map here. Okay, so basically, he was from Alabama and Missouri, and you can see here these are slave states. Then he went to Minnesota with his owner, and he lived there for over a year. When he came back to the slave states, he argued that, hey, I should be free, okay, because there were laws that said once you're free, you're free. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and this Supreme Court Justice Taney was very racist. So even though he had a great lawyer, he had a great argument. The Supreme Court Justice said, you know what? No, blacks have no right to be here because they're property. And he was so absurd in using the metaphor of, oh, we're like a horse would not come here to ask for his freedom, and blacks have no right. So he basically dehumanized African Americans and people of color. So the Dred Scott case is important because it created outrage in the nation, because how are you going to call um, people of color not human? So it created many abolitionists, people who it convinced many people to become abolitionists. So this was in 1857, the Dred Scott case. Now we go from that to later on fighting the Civil War, and the North wins, yay! So slavery is becomes illegal, and the 13th Amendment. And you have the 14th Amendment that says that everyone should be equal under the law. It's pretty clear what that means. But you have a Plessy versus Ferguson case that challenges that. Well, what does equal under the law mean? So it was a landmark case of 1896. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which an African American train passenger, Homer Plessy, so here we see Homer Plessy, he refused to sit in a car for blacks, okay, rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated. The Supreme Court ruled that the law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not constitutional. So as a result, Jim Crow laws came about, or were just, well, Jim Crow laws were, from the get-go of the end of the civil rights movement. But basically, this incident here, he's a lot like Rosa Parks, where he sits in a cart that's reserved for whites only. And when he takes it to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court said, it's okay to be separate. We could keep the races separate. That's not breaking the 14th Amendment because you could be separate and equal. So obviously they found a loophole or they're reading it to their own convenience. Okay. Then finally in 1954, you have the Brown versus Board of Ed case. And basically what it's about, it's this beautiful 7-year-old. Both her parents are professional and she moves or they live in a nice um, rich white neighborhood, but because she is African American, she's bused to a neighborhood for blacks. She sues her, and the parents sued, and she basically argues against the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which declared that racial segregation facilities were inherently unequal and ordered all public schools desegregated. So she won the case, luckily, and I'll put this later, but it's heartbreaking the way they won the case because you have Thurgood Marshall, which is an excellent lawyer, um, argue this. Um, the way he convinces people is by in the Brown versus Board of Ed case is by calling children in and basically um, oh, here it is. Okay. Basically asking children to identify the good doll, the bad doll, and uh, African American children basically said that um, they pointed they to the black doll as the bad dolls. So he proved that separating or segregated schools are affecting children psychologically.
Now show me a colored doll. Show me the doll that you like best. And which doll is most like you?
So I'll put a link to this. It's very heartbreaking. They've done this study recently,
All right,
and
and
it's
show
sad
me
that
a
it's
white
been
doll.
more than 50 years, but yet it's actually been more than 70 years,
Show
but
me
yet
a colored doll.
they many people of color still, many children of color still answer the same way.
Show me the doll that has a nice color.
Okay, so I put the link there. It is a very eye-opening and heartbreaking experiment, but you could it helped win the Brown versus Board of Ed case. So here we have another case. This case was actually before the Brown versus Board of Ed. um, it's Mendes versus Westminster, and basically Sylvia Mendes wanted to go to a school in Orange County where it was mostly for whites. So when she went there, they told her she couldn't go. And she's like, well, I'm confused because my cousins are here and they're Mexican. And the response was, oh, I didn't know they were Mexican because, they looked white. So because her cousins who were Mexican, white Mexicans, were there, she won the case. And that was actually um, a way that the NAACP was able to win the desegregation of schools by many. This was the first case that pushed the the agenda, and then many cases um, were put forward to end desegregation. Here we see Obama giving her the Medal of Honor. I met her. I have a picture with her. I can't find a picture, but it was quite nice to meet her. Okay, another important case related to the civil rights movement was the Regents of the University of California versus Blake. And basically, what this case, this is later on, uh, what it says is that you cannot use affirmative action. Let me explain affirmative action before I explain this term. Do I have affirmative action? Yes, good. A policy in which educational admission or job hiring that gives special attention to compensatory treatment of traditionally disadvantaged groups in an effort to overcome the present effects of past discrimination. So, in other words, um, every school, every business should have at least a person of color. So here we see, I just found this drawing online. I thought it was interesting. So you have Harvard admission of 2020, and you see a lot of whites going in and a lot of Asians. But when it comes to Black and Latinos, they're just like, oh, sorry, it's just too competitive. You can't, you didn't get a good score on the SAT, and often the SAT is used as a way to stop Black and Latinos from going in. And you're like, well, why can't they just get a good test score? Keep in mind, there's a lot of underlining reasons. Some of them, you could believe or not believe, but they say that uh, when you are in a culture where it's mostly family oriented, you don't tend to do well in multiple choice because you have the elimination process. And Latinos and Blacks are not taught to eliminate; they're taught to include. So it many many aspects, and also keep in mind that people who are rich, their children start practicing for the SATs as young as kindergarten. So you have in the rich neighborhoods, you have a lot of SAT prep locations where in um, neighborhoods where you don't have the same means, you're not going to have that SAT prep. And some schools offer it, but again, that depends on funding. So this is what basically happened in this case. So, because of affirmative action, universities were required to allow a certain amount of people of color. So, here we have um, this young white male got rejected, even though his test scores were higher than than um, some people of color. And he argued, "Hey, you're discriminating against me because I have higher test scores and they got in just because they're black. That's not right." So the Supreme Court argued that it was unconstitutional, that his constitutional rights were violated because we were not being fair to whites. Okay. So you have later on, you have this proposition, California Proposition 209, and basically what it did, it it prohibited affirmative action. Okay, so the results of that we see here is that, um, yeah, this is University of California. So we see dramatically how in the UC system, how African Americans, it was 70% and it went to 57. So it dropped down dramatically. And even more in Berkeley, look at that, from 50% to 15%. And American Indians, look how much it dropped because you don't have the affirmative action. But for Asian and whites, it hardly moved. But for African Americans, American Indians, and Latinos, the proposition uh, greatly affected these populations. And if you go to the U.S. system in Berkeley, you mostly see whites and Asians, um, because there's no push to accept uh, people of color. Okay, so those are important Supreme Court cases, and we see the evolution of, you have Dred Scott, where uh, Dred Scott being told, "You're not even human, don't come in here." Horrific. And then you have, okay, all right, fine, but you're human, but just move, let's separate whites over here and people of color over here. And then you finally have the Brown Board of Ed case saying, you know what, this is wrong. Segregation is wrong. Okay. But then you have, oh, okay, well, segregation is wrong, but you cannot force people to integrate, which is what affirmative action was trying to do. Was the government was trying to force integration, and then that was labeled as, oh no, that's not right, because then you're violating people's rights. You're not being equal. Then you're just favoring. But unfortunately, what happens here is um, you have people have who don't have the means, not have the opportunities to the same opportunity as people who do have means. So sometimes I don't even think this is a race issue. I'm very proud to say I graduated from the City University of New York, and they used affirmative action, but it wasn't based on color. So they found a loophole. They used it based on economic levels, or if you grew up poor. And it was quite rewarding, because since I worked as a counselor, I noticed too there were a lot of poor Americans, especially in the Appalachian region, who would apply for this affirmative act. This, well, we didn't call it affirmative action, but it was an opportunity. They changed the term, and also people of color were able to apply. So I would like to compare this to the City University of New York, where they do have funds for, they don't say people of color because that's unconstitutional, but they say people who are low income. Okay, so we see how the struggle for equal rights has taken on years, and it still continues. And to fight for your freedom, every generation has to demand their rights. Its right is not, it's not something you're born with. It's not a privilege. It's something that you have to fight for. Okay, so one of the greatest fighters, and I hope everybody knows, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a U.S. Baptist minister and civil rights leader, a noted orator. He opposed discrimination against blacks by organizing nonviolent resistance and peaceful mass demonstration. Okay, he won a Nobel Prize in 1964. So basically, he used Jesus's non-passive resistance. So if they try to attack you, you don't attack back, because then you look bad. Then your protest just becomes a riot. And here's the thing: if you have a whole bunch of people demanding rights who are not educated, it's called a riot. But if you have a doctor leading the path, then it's called a movement. Okay, so it's very important for the professionals, the educated minorities, to step up and lead the revolution. Okay, all right, and I want to compare uh, Dr. King with Malcolm X. Okay, so here we have Malcolm X. And many people, I remember one of the teachers, she had a poster of both Dr. King and Malcolm X. So he was a member of the Nation of Islam. He promised to find equality for Black Americans using any means necessary, um, which really worried white people, because they often refer to Black Power. So the history books, they tend to focus more on Dr. King, because he believed in passive resistance and people were not afraid of that. Where Malcolm X basically said, look, as Black Americans, as people of color, we're not going to be ever accepted. So he believed in, what, let's, if we need to use um, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, we will use that and to defend our people, because he said, the cops are corrupt, the government is corrupt, they're trying to kill us. We need to just form our own society away from whites, which Dr. King said we need to integrate, we need to have peace, and he's like, nah, we need to form our own community, build our own communities. Okay, another great leader was Dr. Rosa Parks. Okay, you see her here. Okay, I hope everybody knows these these great leaders, even before you took my class. If you lived in the United States, if you went to school in the United States in middle school, or you would know who these guys are. Okay, so I'm sorry, Dr. Rosa Parks. She was a civil rights leader who refused to give up her seat, kind of like Plessy on a bus, but now it's much later on, so it's a bus, to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama, to trigger the national civil rights movement. So, an interesting fact: he's a civil rights leader as well. So they did this on purpose. She knew she was going to get arrested, um, and it was a way to start the boycott movement, to start the civil rights movement. Okay, another great leader was Thurgood Marshall. This is him right here. And he was the lawyer for the Brown versus Board of Ed. And he was the first Black Supreme Court justices, which is, as you know, it's a very powerful position. Okay. All right. Also, we have another great leader of the civil rights movement is Cesar Chavez, and his wife Dolores Huerta. Um, Basically, they argued, or they fought against the treatment of Mexicans coming into this country. And I know in my last video I explained how, during the Bracero program, Mexicans were asked to come to this country to help work the farmland, and as soon as they got here they would make them, strip naked, which was a way to again dehumanize them, and then they would spray these toxic pesticides all over them. And I mentioned in the last video too that my father-in-law was part of the Bracero program, and he died quite young, and he died of Alzheimer's, and he had headaches, and um, a horrible, painful death, and it was because of the pesticides that he was subjected to. Okay. So here is Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and they basically formed the Farm Union. So this benefits not just Mexican Americans, but all farmers, in that they asked for just basic things like to wear a mask, okay, for farmers to put. For farmers to be treated humanely. And that's the famous saying that when people march, they usually say this, si se puede, which means yes, we can. So he was told often, like, you're just a Mexican. What are you going to do? You can't fight against these great big powers. And he's like, yes, yes, I can. Yes, I can. And just an interesting note, I mean, we're talking about African Americans, we're talking about Latinos. Uh, they united to fight for human rights, and you also have whites. Here you have Robert Kennedy, and um, one of the strength that Cesar Chavez was that he united with Filipinos and Japanese farmers as well. So it wasn't us against them, because that would have collapsed. The civil rights movement was actually, uh, anyone who believed that people have the right to just basic human rights. Okay, so it wasn't just one group. It was one group or one race. It was everybody uniting for a common cause. Okay, so I want to talk about what are some ways. How did they protest? Okay, so there are many ways to protest. Writing a letter is a form of protest. Voting is a form of protest. Anything that you say, no, this is not right. Okay, so here we have like passive. You could display signs, have flowers, and say this is not right. Flyers, excuse me. Petition. You could picket. Soapboxing is basically, back in the days they used to deliver soap in wooden boxes. So you just take the box and you stand on the box and you just start talking to anyone and start saying, look, this is what's going on. Now social media is a sign of is a form of protest. Recording an injustice on the cell phone is a sign of protest. um, okay, so you have occupation. So teachers, yay, journalists, nurses, doctors. This could be a sign of protest. This why I became a teacher, because I was tired of hearing why do Latinos have low test scores, you know, and being labeled as someone who cannot learn, and that was very irritating to me. And I said, no, that's not true. That's not true. So it's my occupation is a form of protest, locking down an area. Okay. Um, Disruptive picketing, you have demonstrations, strikes, sit-ins, and boycotts. So I want to discuss more, and all of those could be violent and non-violent depending. Okay. Um, okay, so strikes. Let me discuss strikes. Okay, so what are strikes? So strikes are basically when you refuse to work, okay, until your demands are met, okay. And keep in mind, throughout history, many people have died. So just striking and have been burned violently. So again, we see throughout history people having to fight for their rights. Okay, and here you have another form of protest. You have sit-ins, which basically means you just refuse to sit. You refuse to leave until your demands are met. And this is a famous picture of Woolworths, where you have the segregation laws where blacks were not allowed to sit down, and these are all civil rights leaders. And what you see is these people here just mocking them, pouring, here you see someone poured hot coffee on him, pouring juice, humiliating them, uh, because they said, no, I want to sit here. And as a human being, I have the right to sit where you sit. We're both human. Um, so those are the sit-ins. And we see sit-ins here. This was recently uh, with the George Floyd case, the appalling case, the dehumanizing of people, and how in here in LA you have people sitting in and protesting that. Okay, boycott is another form of protest. So what do you do when you boycott? Boycott, your money is very powerful. So if you do not like the way something is, follow the money, and then don't give your money to an organization, right, to a person, a nation, or business, because the protesters do not agree. Do not agree. If you do not agree with a person, nation, or business, don't give them your money. I remember I went into a store once and the lady was following me around because she thought I was going to steal something, and I'm like, you know what, I just said to her, I don't appreciate you following me around. What you're doing is unconstitutional, and I'm going to boycott your store, and I'm going to make sure all my friends boycott your store. Okay. So it's when you refuse. So one of the most famous boycotts during the civil rights movement was the Montgomery bus boycott. So basically, people refused to take the bus because of the segregation laws that basically told blacks they needed to sit in the back of the bus. So you have people walking, um, and also you have people helping people go to their jobs. Okay, so it's not like, oh, okay, I'm going to walk to work. No, people, this was uh, this was difficult for many people. I remember reading a primary document when they asked an elderly lady, how long have you been walking? And she was walking miles. And her response was, well, my feet are tired, but my soul is happy. I don't want to misquote, but it's just, it tells you that boycotting is very effective. And I remember reading the primary document where the owner of the bus company was like, we don't need Negro people money, and just complaining. And meanwhile, when he's saying this, it destroyed the bus company. So yeah, it is a powerful way to protest. So here you have also says that Chavez, where he just announced boycott grapes, boycott California grapes, and this is a big issue because California is an agricultural state, and grapes, Napa Valley with the wine it's part of our economy, and it was hard for people to boycott, but he did it. And again, the wine companies, they were like, oh, we don't need Mexicans, it's okay, please, it's not gonna, you have no power over us. But yet their pockets were hurting, and they had to eventually listen to them. Okay. And these are some companies that people are boycotting because they're responsible for global warming. So there's a lot of things, like when the whole incident with ICE was happening, I said, okay, what are companies that are supporting ICE? And I do boycott. I boycott Walmart because of their inhumane policies. And even though it's very hard to boycott them because sometimes they're the only company that sells something, and they're cheap, but you know what? I need to stick to my guns and say no. You're like, well, what is one person going to do? But you know what? You can't have that mentality. So, okay, so those are different forms of protest. Now I want to discuss the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. So, what did all this protest do? Okay, well, one great accomplishment that we have is you have the legal desegregation of schools. Okay, so schools were no longer, you cannot uh, desegregate school. And we see, of course, we mentioned Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer, um, the cutie pie here who sued. She was only like 7 years old. Okay, but that wasn't the end of it. So what happened when schools were desegregated? Well, you have the famous Little Rock Nine. There's lots of documentaries out. So basically, they were the first African American students to attend an all white school, and this was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it got so bad that the president had to send the military because there were all these protesters. They were whites who refused to go to school. They were striking. They said, oh no, I'm not going to go to school with blacks. Um, you see here this woman shouting, and they were just being very cruel to the nine students, uh, to the point where the guards had to follow them in. Um, Oh, here we go. The nine students who were brave enough to go into an all-white school. And if you see some of the documentaries, I think I have a documentary there. You could link on it. It's on Netflix. Um, of what they experienced. I went to a seminar once, and it was quite interesting because this lady here screaming nasty things to her. Okay, in the future they become best friends, believe it or not. um, and they tour together, and they discuss, you know then and now, and how do you go from being an oppressor to being an advocate. So that was quite fascinating. Okay. So you have one, the desegregation, and it just, it's not like because something is a law. Oh, okay. Now we're all ha ha ha. Now everything is all great. No, it doesn't work like that. It takes a lot of bravery and effort um, to end inhumane practices. Okay, another accomplishment that the civil rights created was the elimination of poll taxes. So remember, I mentioned before that you had to pay to vote, and often when they would see people of color, they would charge them more, or just be ridiculous, trying not to let them vote. So here, the 24th Amendment says you're not supposed to pay to vote. It has to be free. Okay. So you have all these laws. Oh, we have the Voting Rights Act later on. Okay. Let me just, all right. Another accomplishment was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And if you apply for any job, you should see in the bottom that says that it's prohibited to discriminate based on race, color, sex, religion, or or national origins by your employer. Right now, the Supreme Court is looking at sex in terms of, because they meant it gender, and now they're seeing, does this law also apply to the LGBT community? So this law is very much alive and kicking. So if you go to a job or a school or anywhere and you're discriminated because of your race, your religion, or your gender or because of where you come from, you could sue based on this law. So the law is quite lengthy, but I did put a document there if you would like to read it. Okay, so going back to the Voting Rights Act, okay? So according to the Voting Rights Act, you cannot um, stop someone from voting if they meet the requirements. And even today, believe it or not, there's still a lot of um, discrimination when it comes to voting. Like you see neighborhoods where they're mostly minorities, they'll just lose the box of votes, or they'll do construction at that time, or they'll make it very difficult for the people to vote. I mean, you don't see this so much in, well, there may be examples in Los Angeles, but in other states, it's so blatant how they really do try to take away people's rights to vote. And I found this interesting because so many people have died uh, and continue to die in other countries for this right to vote. And it's devastating to see how little, what the percentage of Americans who vote. So if you're out there protesting right now, keep in mind that one of the biggest forms of protest once you turn 18 is your right to vote. Okay. Another great accomplishment of the civil rights movement was the Fair Housing Act. So, if you remember in my last video, I talked about after World War II with the GI Bill, you have Levittown, you have all these beautiful houses being formed for the World War II veterans. But then, even though they had the GI Bill, uh, only white Americans could live in this nice neighborhood. Uh, People of color were not allowed to go into these neighborhoods. So, one of the laws that was created is that you cannot discriminate. Okay. Uh, they still do, of course, but a landlord cannot straight out say, you know, I'm not renting to you because you're Latino. They can't say that. That's illegal. Okay. Or I'm not renting to you because you're Muslim or because you're black or whatever. You cannot do that. They do it anyways, but they'll use another excuse like, oh, you have bad credit. What, you know, that's actually legit, but you cannot blatantly say, we, you cannot say uh, you can we're not going to rent to you because we just don't like your race or whatever. Okay. Now the Black Panthers, I know I'm going to get some pushback here, okay, because I did put it under accomplishment and how it spread. I personally have met many Black Panthers in my college years protesting, and I know many people say that they were militant, they were abusive. Okay, but just want to give you both perspective. Okay, so it's a political organization formed in 1966 by Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale to challenge police brutality. So this whole idea of police brutality, obviously, it's nothing new. But now with the cell phones, we record it more against African American community, and you see they dressed in the black berets and the black leather jackets. Um, yeah, and they were armed. They used the Second Amendment right, and because of that, they were very much feared. And what happened is the FBI had secret agents go in and start selling them a lot of, weed and drugs, and unfortunately, that brought down the organization. And the reason why I'm saying unfortunately, I know that some people fear the Black Panthers, is because um, they provided a lot of health care and free food. And I guess the reason why I just appreciate is that they rewrote history, because history was mostly written by the oppressing class, and in this case it would be the rich whites. um, so in the 1960s there was this whole push of rewriting history. Native Americans rewrote the histories, African Americans rewrote the history, and many of my college professors at the City University of New York came from the 1960s, and they gave me a different perspective of history. Okay. So here we see see, they did help out the people a lot. So I know uh, they're portrayed mostly as being aggressive and militant, but they also helped out their community basically. And okay, and here you have, Angela Davis. There's a great documentary out on her. Okay, oh, there we go. Free Angela, if you get a chance to watch it. Okay. Okay, so again, I mentioned it wasn't just African Americans, it was Latinos, and of course, I can't forget my people, the Native Americans, okay? And they also, were motivated or inspired, if you will, by the whole civil rights movement. And again, this was hard to find too because the American Indian movement or AIM often, I was doing some research and Encyclopedia Britannica and others would, they say, oh, they're a militant group, they used arms, they were aggressive, but I just want to give you a different perspective on that. And they were what they were protesting was all these broken treaties and the Battle of Wounded Knee and how they were just complete genocide when the Pilgrims came, and how even to today they're mistreated, and how right now we talk about like COVID-19 and how in these tribal lands that they were pushed to have high incidence of COVID-19, and they don't even have running water, and it's very devastating. So they just want just the basic uh, human rights as everybody wants. Okay, so we have 500 years, of course, that's referring to colonial America. Okay, and one big thing with Native Americans is that they they take Mother Earth, that's a goddess, and you respect the land. So here, Native Americans are also urging people to please uh, not pollute the environment, and that goes with the next form of protest, which is global warming. And as you may know, it's the pollution is causing the earth to heat up and destroying our planet. So there's also this movement comes about too. So the 1960s, you have a lot of people saying, what are the human rights? Let's talk about human rights. Let's talk about the environment. It is a human right to have clean air, to be able to breathe. We hear that a lot. Let me breathe. Okay. Also, you have the Individuals with Disability Act. People with disability also said, hey, I should have the right to have um, services for me. Okay. So you have basic services like before, if you were in a wheelchair, it's like, oh, you couldn't go to school. You were basically said, well, you just stay home now. But people with disabilities said, no, why? So you have laws where buildings have to have ramps, and that doesn't just benefit people with disability, that benefits everybody. So it basically refers to its legislation is a law granting educational rights to people with cognitive, emotional, or physical disability from birth until age 21. Okay, so and then you have these laws keep changing. So this is part of like the special education program, where just because you have a disability uh, doesn't mean that you are outcast. It actually means that you have to be able to graduate and have services to help you graduate and become a happy, productive citizen. Okay. And again, these programs benefit everybody. Another group of people who fought for their liberal rights was the LGBT community, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and others. They fought for their rights too. There were laws against homosexualities, and it was considered a sin. Some of them were put to death because of it. So the LGBT community also comes out and says, "No, we're human too. We deserve rights." Okay, so right here you have there's a great PBS special that talks about uh, the whole movement of the LGBT community. Also, women also say, hey, we're human too. We want equal rights. So here we have now, which is the National Organization of Women, and they want human rights. And I would like to just do a little quick history of women in U.S. history using images. So here we see in the 1600s the Pilgrims. So the British Pilgrims, unlike the Spaniards, the British came with their family, and women were very much involved in the survival. Then we have the American Revolution. You know, you have Betsy Ross make the American flag. You have women fighting with the soldiers. Okay, then you have U.S. expansion, and keep in mind in the West Coast there were not many females, so the few females that were there had a lot of power because they were uh, important because there were very few of them. During the Industrial Revolution, you have many females working in factories. Okay, so women say, "Oh, women have worked outside and inside the home." Here's an example of the wars, World War I and World War II, when they served as nurses. Many of them created the bombs, and of course, you have the famous Rosie the Riveter. Okay. Also, in the 1920s, you have the women finally get the right to vote nationally. Here in the West Coast, you see that women had the right to vote before the 1920s. Uh, so then you have the flapper movement, where women cut their hair short. They like to dance. So it was a revolution of what it means to be a female, because many of the men were at war and they wanted the right to work outside. Okay, and when the war ended, many women didn't want to return home. They wanted to keep working. And because of that, women are blamed for the Great Depression. So, what happens when the flappers who were later blamed for the Great Depression have girls? They encouraged their girls to be stay at home wives. And we remember that in the 1950s, there was this economic prosperity. And one of the reasons that they say that when it was because women were encouraged to go back home and become housewife and not have a career. They were told, you see, because the flappers refused to go back home, you have the Great Depression. So in the 1950s, you have this ideal of women needing to be housewives. And of course, the children rebel and better society. So the 19 women in the 1950s had children who became hippies, who you see are complete opposites of their parents, in that they didn't want to comb their hairs, they didn't want to be so neat and perfect, because they noticed that in women, the 1950 housewives were very miserable. There was a lot of domestic violence. um, so in the 1970s, women rebelled against that whole 1950s mentality of women cannot have a career, women have to stay at home, um, and say, well, it's tradition that women, stay at home and the men go work. So here we have a good quote that says, "When men are oppressed, it's a tragedy, but when women are oppressed, it's a tradition." Um, so that's what they mostly fought. They fought for the right to get a divorce. And if you see here, divorce was very throughout U.S. history. We see a particular time span, but it was basically unheard of to hear women getting a divorce. Women were considered a property of men, and there were many laws that justified that. So in the 1970s, women fought for the right to get a divorce, and you see this later on, where Wonder Woman, and it's like, oh, death to all men, don't come in here. And then in the 80s, you have famous uh, artists like Pat Benatar. When "Hit Me with Your Best Shot," she's talking about domestic violence and child abuse. Um, and in the 80s, you see women working. And interestingly, if you look at their fashion, they have big shoulder pads, and their fashion was for them to look more masculine. Uh, So you have here, hello, 1950s Cole, you left your oppressive gender roles in our century. So you have a lot of people joking around or just saying, here's, I don't want to be that housewife that has to listen to her husband. Okay. But now gender roles have changed. Okay. Now you see men participating more in the house, and both male and females are responsible for child rearing, where men in the 1950s, they didn't change diapers. That was, that's a female job, or cooking, that's female. Where now the new feminists are, you know what, if I want to work, that's fine. If I want to have kids, that's fine. But it's um, moving towards, how do we have more equity for African Americans, for Latinos, for Asian, for the LGBT community, for people with disability, for females. It's just it's what history shows us is basically, how do we obtain human rights? How do we make this world a better place so there's fairness and respect for everybody? So I hope this lesson taught you and served you well. Okay. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.